All right, welcome everyone to today's deep dive. We're going to be tackling a topic that I think is always interesting and kind of sparks debate. And that is this idea of a one world government, sometimes called the New World Order. And the source material that we're going to be looking at today is excerpts from the book Final Warning, A History of the New World Order. So this book makes some pretty bold claims. And our mission today is really to unpack those, to understand who these people are that are behind this alleged New World Order, what motivates them, and really how they supposedly operate.
One of the things that I found really fascinating is that the author initially didn't believe in these theories about these powerful figures controlling the world. And it was only after 6 years of research, particularly on the Illuminati, that they became convinced that this was more than just a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, that's really intriguing, and I think it makes their claims even more compelling, that they started as a skeptic. So let's talk about the Illuminati. Who are they?
Well, the book pinpoints Dr. Adam Weishaupt as the founder of this secretive group back in 1748. And his background is a little bit of a sons of a Jewish rabbi, raised Catholic, even became a priest for a while, but ultimately became an atheist. Weishaupt was a scholar deep into law, economics, politics, history, and was influenced by French philosophers like Voltaire. And the book even suggests that King Frederick II of Prussia, a Freemason, had connections to the Illuminati.
Wow. So right off the bat, we're seeing potential links to some very influential historical figures. But how did this group supposedly wield its power?
Well, Final Warning claims that financial manipulation was key. The book talks about powerful financiers like the Rothschilds pulling strings behind major global events. And it even gives a specific example involving Mayer Rothschild and Prince William of Hesse-Kassel during the Napoleonic Wars.
The Rothschilds, I mean, those names carry a lot of weight, especially in finance. What happened with them and Prince William?
Well, it's like something out of a movie. Prince William, fleeing Napoleon's forces, left his fortune with Rothschild for safekeeping. Napoleon, savvy as ever, knew this and offered Rothschild a 25% cut if he handed it over.
25%? I mean, that's a king's ransom, right? What did Rothschild do?
Well, the book says he flat out refused, hid the ledgers, stashed the cash, basically told Napoleon to take a hike. And Final Warning argues this shows the incredible power that these financiers held, even defying emperors.
That's a bold move that definitely suggests they weren't just bankers, but players on a global chessboard, as it were. But is that the only example that the book offers of this kind of financial maneuvering, or is there more to the story?
Oh, there's more. The book claims there's a secret vault, the Bruton Vault, supposedly holding vast wealth, important documents, and even advanced technology beyond its time. Thomas Jefferson is mentioned as the last person to access it back in 1804. And it gets wilder. The book says the vault's contents were later moved maybe to the University of Virginia or even the Capitol building.
Okay, now we're entering conspiracy theory territory. So we've got financial power, secret societies, a hidden vault. But how does all of this tie back to the Illuminati's supposed goal of a one-world government?
That's where the Freemasons come into the picture. Final Warning links the Illuminati and Freemasons, directly claiming some of America's founding fathers like Benjamin Franklin and George Washington were involved in both. It even points out that many signers of the Declaration of Independence were believed to be Freemasons, and that a Masonic Bible is used for presidential oaths.
Hold on, are they saying George Washington, the father of our nation, was in the Illuminati? I mean, that's a pretty serious accusation.
It is. And to back it up, the book mentions John Robeson, a high-ranking Freemason. He supposedly went to Germany, got hold of the Illuminati's updated plans, and became disillusioned. In 1798, he published a book exposing their alleged goals of global domination.
So it's a web of secret societies, financial influence, and even founding fathers potentially involved. It's a fascinating, if somewhat unsettling, theory. But how does the book connect all of this to control over American finances specifically?
Well, Final Warning goes deep into the history of American banking. It examines the first and second bank of the United States, and particularly President Andrew Jackson's fight against them. The argument is that these banks weren't serving the American people, but were tools for private bankers, some international, to manipulate the entire system for their benefit.
So it's suggesting that these figures were pulling the strings behind the scenes. Was there any resistance to this supposed control?
The book portrays President Jackson as a champion against this system. He vetoed the second bank's charter, abolished it in 1832, moved government funds to state banks. And get this, according to Final Warning, he paid off the national debt, the only time that's ever happened in U.S. history.
That's quite an accomplishment, if true. It seems that Jackson saw this financial control as a direct threat to American freedom and sovereignty.
Exactly. And the book argues this struggle for financial control didn't end with Jackson. It points to the Federal Reserve System, claiming it's the modern-day tool for this group to exert control over the nation's finances.
The Federal Reserve, that's a big one. What specifically does the book claim about it?
It really scrutinizes the Federal Reserve, arguing that it isn't a true government institution, but a tool for private interests. The book quotes various congressmen and influential figures who criticize the Federal Reserve for operating in secrecy and lacking accountability.
So if we're following the book's logic, it's implying that this group has been manipulating the U.S. financial system for its own agenda, using institutions like the Federal Reserve to maintain control.
That's the gist of it. And it gets even more intriguing. The book claims there's a new money already printed and hidden, ready to be introduced after the current monetary system collapses.
Whoa, new money just waiting in the wings. What's the purpose of that? Is this all leading to some grand financial reset?
That's what Final Warning suggests. It ties this new money to the ultimate goal of ushering in a one-world government with a completely restructured global economy.
Okay, it's all starting to sound like a high-stakes thriller here. Financial control, secret institutions, a hidden vault, and now a new money system waiting to be unleashed. But does the book address how they're shaping public opinion to achieve these goals?
That's where the role of tax-free foundations comes in. Final Warning argues that some of these foundations, particularly the Rockefeller Foundation, are promoting ideologies, especially socialist and globalist ideas, that weaken national sovereignty and pave the way for a global governing body.
Fair nations like charitable organizations.
Yes, but the book contends that these foundations, while appearing charitable, are actually promoting specific agendas that align with this one-world government goal.
So it's suggesting philanthropy is being used as a tool to advance this larger hidden agenda. Were there any investigations into these claims?
The book mentions congressional investigations into these foundations, with accusations of communist influence being thrown around. It paints a picture of these organizations not simply funding good causes, but also acting as vehicles for social and political engineering.
This is getting more complex by the minute. So we have financial manipulation, secret societies, a hidden vault, new money waiting to be introduced. And now foundations shaping public opinion. It's a very elaborate web. But how does the book explain major world events like the world wars within this framework?
This is where Final Warning makes a controversial claim. It argues that both world wars were deliberately orchestrated by this powerful group to achieve their own financial and political goals.
Both world wars. Are they saying those devastating global conflicts resulting in millions of deaths were engineered? What's the logic behind such a claim?
The book claims that wars are immensely profitable for certain industries, like arms manufacturers and financiers. It claims figures like J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller had vested interests in pushing America into World War I, aiming to protect their European financial interests.
So it's suggesting these wars weren't just tragic events, but calculated moves in some grand global scheme. What about the aftermath of World War I and the formation of the League of Nations?
Final Warning sees the League of Nations as a key step towards their goal of a one-world government. It argues that though it ultimately failed, it was an early attempt at establishing a global governing body.
That's interesting. Even a failed attempt could be seen as a stepping stone, a learning experience for those allegedly pushing for this one-world system. But if that's the case, how have they supposedly continued to advance their agenda since then? What else does the book reveal?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. Final Warning even draws attention to the imagery on the U.S. dollar bill, claiming it's packed with Masonic and Illuminati symbolism.
Like the all-seeing eye on the back of the dollar.
Exactly. The book suggests these symbols aren't random designs, but deliberate messages pointing to this group's influence.
Okay, so we've got wars potentially orchestrated for profit, a failed League of Nations as a stepping stone, and even hidden symbolism in plain sight. This is all very intriguing, but it also begs the question: how does the rise of ideologies like socialism and communism factor into all of this?
That's another fascinating point. Final Warning connects the rise of both socialism and communism to the Illuminati's goals. It examines organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, and the Fabian Society, claiming their fronts for advancing these ideologies to weaken capitalist societies and make them more susceptible to global control.
The ACLU, they're a well-known civil rights organization. That's quite a statement. But what's the connection between these ideologies and a one-world government?
The book argues that these groups are part of a long-term strategy to undermine traditional power structures and pave the way for a global socialist system.
So according to Final Warning, even the rise of the Soviet Union could be seen as part of this grand plan.
That's what the book suggests. It goes so far as to criticize American foreign policy, particularly financial aid given to communist countries, claiming it actually strengthened the Soviet Union and inadvertently furthered their agenda.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground here. From secret societies and financial manipulation to orchestrated wars and the rise of specific ideologies, Final Warning paints a very complex picture. But is there a more recent example of this alleged group's influence in the modern world?
Yes, and this is where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive. Final Warning introduces the Trilateral Commission, founded by David Rockefeller, as another major player in the push for a one-world government.
The Trilateral Commission. That's a name that often comes up in discussions about global conspiracies. Sounds like we're about to delve even deeper into this web of intrigue and interconnected events.
We are. Final Warning doesn't hold back in connecting this group to powerful individuals and global events. It's going to be a fascinating and perhaps unsettling journey as we continue to unravel this complex narrative.
Well, listeners, buckle up, because our deep dive into Final Warning, a history of the New World Order, is just getting started. Join us in part 2 as we explore the Trilateral Commission, regional governments, manufactured crises, and more.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Final Warning. Last time, we left off with the book's claim that the Trilateral Commission is a key player in this push for a one-world government.
Yeah, the Trilateral Commission, it's a name that always seems to pop up in conversations about, these shadowy global elites and their supposed agenda. So what exactly does Final Warning have to say about them?
Well, the book argues that the Trilateral Commission, founded by David Rockefeller back in the 1970s, aims to restructure the global political and economic landscape, ultimately leading to, you guessed it, a one-world government.
Okay, so restructuring global systems, that sounds like it would require a lot of influence. Does the book give any specifics about how they're supposedly doing this?
It suggests that the Trilateral Commission has had significant influence on American presidents, and it highlights Jimmy Carter as a prime example.
Right, Jimmy Carter. He was a member of the Trilateral Commission.
He was, and the book argues that Carter's presidency was heavily shaped by the Commission's agenda. It points to his focus on international diplomacy and his efforts to promote global cooperation as evidence of their influence.
So Final Warning is claiming that a group like the Trilateral Commission could essentially influence the policies of a U.S. president to further their own goals. But how does this all tie back to the idea of a one-world government? Is the book suggesting that individual nations will simply cease to exist?
Not exactly. Final Warning discusses the concept of regional governments as a stepping stone towards a global governing body, and it cites the European Union as a prime example.
The European Union. So it's a collection of independent nations that have come together under a single economic and political system. Is Final Warning suggesting that the EU is like a model for a future world government?
That's the implication. The book sees the EU as a blueprint for how national sovereignty can be gradually eroded and replaced with larger supranational entities.
So it's like a gradual process of integration and consolidation, eventually leading to a single global authority. But it's not just the EU. Right, doesn't the book mention other groups involved in this supposed plan?
Yes, it does. Final Warning also mentions these secretive groups, like the Bilderberg Group, where powerful figures from around the world gathered to discuss global issues and policies.
The Bilderberg Group. Ah, yes, another one that conspiracy theorists love to talk about. What does Final Warning say about their role in all of this?
It suggests that groups like the Bilderberg Group are where the real decisions are being made, behind closed doors, away from public scrutiny. It's like a shadow government, shaping global events and influencing policy decisions.
It's all starting to sound like a real-life episode of House of Cards here, with powerful individuals making backroom deals to advance their own agenda. But if this plan has been in motion for so long, how have they managed to keep it under wraps? How have they shaped public opinion to support their goals?
This is where Final Warning gets really unsettling. It suggests that this group deliberately creates crises to manipulate public opinion and advance its agenda.
Wait, they create crises? Intentionally? That seems pretty far-fetched. What kind of crises are we talking about?
It points to events like the energy crisis of the 1970s, the AIDS epidemic, and even the current economic instability as examples of this calculated chaos.
Hold on. They're claiming that the AIDS epidemic was manufactured. That's a very serious accusation. What evidence do they offer to support such a claim?
The book delves into the origins of the AIDS virus, suggesting that it could have been created in a lab and intentionally released.
Okay, that's getting into some pretty controversial territory. And how do they supposedly control the population during these times of manufactured chaos? What's their end game here?
Final Warning claims the existence of government plans for mass detention camps, citing a program called Rex 84 as evidence that they're preparing to round up and detain citizens during a state of emergency.
Detention camps on American soil? That's a chilling thought. And what about the increasing militarization of police forces that we've seen in recent years?
The book ties that into the plan as well. It argues that this militarization is part of a larger effort to create a police state, where dissent is silenced and the population is kept under strict control.
It's all starting to sound very dystopian, like something out of a science fiction novel. But we've been talking about these groups and their supposed agenda for a while now. Let's switch gears a little bit and delve into the biblical prophecies that Final Warning claims are connected to all of this. How does the book tie those prophecies to current events?
Final Warning focuses on prophecies from the book of Revelation, attempting to connect them to modern events and this alleged plan for a one-world government.
Okay, so it's trying to decode the book of Revelation as like a roadmap for this unfolding conspiracy. That's fascinating. What specific prophecies does it focus on?
It highlights prophecies about the day of the Lord and the signs of the end times, citing verses from the Bible that describe a future world ravaged by war, natural disasters, and divine judgment.
The end times. Yeah, that's a concept that carries a lot of weight, especially in certain religious circles. What does the book say about how these end times will play out?
It dives deep into the book of Daniel, focusing on passages that mention the king of the north and the king of the south as key figures in this final apocalyptic conflict.
Kings of the north and south. That sounds pretty dramatic. But who do these figures represent in the real world? Does the book offer any clues?
Final Warning attempts to decode these symbolic figures. It suggests that the king of the north represents a future European superpower, likely based on the European Union, while the king of the south might represent a coalition of Islamic nations, possibly led by Egypt.
So it's predicting a future war between Europe and the Islamic world. That's a pretty bold prediction. Does it go into any detail about how this conflict might unfold?
It gets even more specific, claiming that this conflict will involve Israel and potentially draw on other nations like Libya and Ethiopia. It paints a picture of a global conflict with Israel at the center.
Okay, so we've got kings of the north and south, a potential global war with Israel at the epicenter, and all of this tied back to biblical prophecies about the end times. It's a lot to process, but let's go back to the idea of the mark of the beast, which we touched on earlier. How does that fit into this apocalyptic scenario?
Final Warning suggests that the implementation of the mark of the beast will be a key event leading up to this final battle. It argues that this mark, which it connects to modern technologies like microchips and biometric identification, will be used to control and enslave the population, forcing them to submit to the authority of the one-world government.
So it's seeing these technological advances not just as tools for convenience or progress, but as potential weapons of control and oppression in the hands of this tyrannical global elite. It's a pretty disturbing thought.
It is. The book argues that we're willingly giving up our freedoms and privacy in the name of progress and convenience, paving the way for a future where we're constantly monitored and controlled.
It's a classic Orwellian scenario with technology being used to create a surveillance state where every move is tracked and every thought is scrutinized. But if this mark of the beast is a key part of their plan, what's their ultimate goal? Why go through all of this effort to control the world?
Final Warning doesn't shy away from this question. It argues that the ultimate goal of this group is the enslavement of humanity.
Enslavement. That's a pretty heavy accusation. What makes them think that this is the end goal?
The book paints a picture of a global elite who see themselves as superior to the rest of humanity. It claims that they believe they're destined to rule the world and that they're willing to use any means necessary to achieve their goal.
So it's not just about power or greed. It's about a fundamental belief in their own superiority and a desire to subjugate the rest of us. That's a chilling thought. But how do they justify this belief in their own superiority? Where does that come from?
Final Warning delves into some interesting and controversial theories about the origins of this elite. It suggests that they might be descended from ancient bloodlines, perhaps even having ties to extraterrestrial beings.
Whoa, extraterrestrials. Now we're entering some seriously fringe territory. But let's set that aside for a moment and focus on the biblical aspect. Earlier, you mentioned that the book interprets the King of the South as a coalition of Islamic nations. Does it go into any more detail about the specific nations that might be involved in this final conflict?
It does. It delves into biblical genealogy, tracing the lineage of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, to suggest that certain modern-day nations are destined to play specific roles in the end times.
Biblical genealogy, that's a new twist. How does that factor into the book's predictions about future conflicts?
It uses these genealogical connections to suggest that certain modern-day nations are destined to play specific roles in the end times. It links the descendants of Japheth to Europe, the descendants of Ham to Africa, and the descendants of Shem to the Middle East.
So it's using the Bible as a kind of historical and prophetic atlas to map out these ancient lineages and connect them to modern geopolitical realities.
Exactly. Final Warning is weaving together a complex narrative that blends history, prophecy, and current events.
It's definitely a unique and thought-provoking approach, but does the book go beyond just identifying the players in this apocalyptic drama? Does it describe how this final battle might actually unfold?
It paints a vivid picture of global devastation, drawing on biblical passages that describe a world engulfed in war, ravaged by natural disasters, and facing divine judgment.
So it's not just a war, it's a full-blown apocalypse. What specific events does it describe?
It talks about the sun being darkened, the moon turning to blood, stars falling from the sky, and the earth being shaken to its core. It even suggests that nuclear weapons might be used, leading to widespread destruction and environmental devastation.
Wow. Nuclear war, celestial upheaval, divine judgment. That's a pretty intense scenario. But amidst all of this destruction and chaos, does Final Warning offer any hope for the future? What happens after this apocalyptic battle?
That's where the book shifts its focus to a more spiritual perspective. It suggests that after this time of tribulation and judgment, Jesus Christ will return to earth to establish his kingdom.
So it's predicting the second coming of Christ. Does it say anything about what this new world under Christ's rule will look like?
It describes a world of peace and harmony, where righteousness prevails and evil is vanquished. It's a vision of a utopian future where humanity is finally free from the grip of this tyrannical elite and lives in harmony with God's will.
Okay, so according to Final Warning, this one world government, the wars, the disasters, the mark of the beast, it's all part of a larger plan that ultimately leads to the return of Christ and the triumph of good over evil.
That's the ultimate message of Final Warning. It's this blend of conspiracy theory, biblical prophecy, and Christian theology, all woven together to create a narrative that's both captivating and concerning.
It's definitely a lot to take in. We've covered a lot of ground here, from secret societies and financial manipulation to biblical genealogy and apocalyptic prophecies. It's a wild ride. But before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to pause and ask you, as someone who has studied these topics, what are your thoughts on this idea that history is being shaped by these powerful, shadowy groups who are working towards a specific agenda?
Well, that's a question that has fascinated and troubled people for centuries. And there's no doubt that power dynamics and hidden agendas exist, that individuals and groups can exert influence in ways that aren't always transparent. But whether there's a single, all-encompassing conspiracy, a grand plan that's been unfolding for centuries, as Final Warning suggests, that's a much more difficult question to answer.
That's a good point. It's important to be aware of the potential for manipulation and control, but it's also important to avoid falling into the trap of seeing conspiracies everywhere.
Exactly. We need to balance a healthy skepticism with a willingness to question the narratives we're presented with, to do our own research and come to our own conclusions.
Well said. And that's a great place to wrap up this part of our deep dive. We've explored Final Warning's predictions about future conflicts, the mark of the beast, and these apocalyptic events that it believes are prophesied in the Bible. When we come back for the final part of our episode, we'll dive into the book's claims about the occult, the New Age movement, and the potential formation of a one-world religion.
It's going to be a fascinating exploration of the forces that might be shaping our world, both seen and unseen.
Stay tuned, listeners, because we're about to go even deeper down the rabbit hole. Welcome back to our deep dive into Final Warning, a history of the New World Order. We've covered a lot of ground already, but now we're entering some truly fascinating and perhaps even unsettling territory as we explore the book's claims about the occult, the New Age movement, and the possibility of a one-world religion.
Yeah, Final Warning ties these elements together in a very intriguing way. It starts by examining the history of Christianity, arguing that it's been deliberately corrupted by satanic influences throughout the centuries.
corrupted by satanic influences. I mean, that's a pretty strong statement. How does the book support that claim?
Well, it points to various historical events and figures. For example, it discusses the rise of Gnosticism in the early church. For those unfamiliar, Gnosticism was an early Christian movement that emphasized personal spiritual knowledge over traditional doctrines. And final warning suggests that Gnosticism was an early attempt to distort the true teachings of Christianity.
So it's suggesting that there have been these deliberate attempts to undermine Christianity from within, going all the way back to the early church. But how does it connect this to more modern movements like the New Age?
Well, the book sees the New Age movement, with its focus on universal spirituality and rejection of traditional religious dogma, as a continuation of these efforts to steer people away from true Christianity. It argues that the New Age movement, while appearing benign on the surface, is actually promoting a spiritual system that's easily manipulated by the global elite.
So it's like a spiritual Trojan horse sneaking in harmful ideas under the guise of peace and enlightenment. What are some of the specific elements of the New Age that Final Warning finds problematic?
Well, it takes issue with the movement's emphasis on Eastern mysticism, alternative healing practices, and the belief in a coming new age of spiritual awakening. It argues that these ideas dilute the core tenets of Christianity and create a more malleable spiritual system that can be co-opted for nefarious purposes.
So if I'm understanding correctly, Final Warning is suggesting that the New Age movement is being used to kind of blur the lines between different religions and spiritual traditions, ultimately paving the way for a single globalized faith. But what would this one world religion look like? Does the book give any specifics?
It suggests that this world religion would incorporate elements from various existing faiths, creating a kind of spiritual hodgepodge that's palatable to a global audience. Think of it as a blending of Christian, Eastern, and New Age beliefs, stripped of any doctrines or teachings that might be seen as divisive or controversial.
So it's like a spiritual smoothie, blending different flavors together to create something that's easy to swallow, but perhaps lacking in substance. But what's the purpose of creating such a watered-down faith? What's the end game here?
Well, Final Warning argues that this one-world religion would be more about control than genuine spiritual seeking. It suggests that it would be used to unify the population under a single belief system, making it easier for the global elite to govern and control.
It sounds like a classic tactic of divide and conquer, but in reverse, unite and conquer. Create a homogeneous belief system, and it's easier to control the masses. But who would lead this one-world religion?
Well, the book reiterates its earlier claim that the Pope, as the head of the Catholic Church, is a likely candidate for this role. It points to the Pope's global influence, the Catholic Church's vast reach, and its history of political involvement as evidence that the papacy could easily be transformed into the leadership of a one-world religion.
So Final Warning is sticking to its guns on this idea that the Pope could be the false prophet mentioned in the Book of Revelation, but does it offer any other potential candidates?
It briefly mentions the possibility of a charismatic New Age guru or spiritual leader really into prominence and assuming that role. However, it seems much more focused on the Pope as the most likely figurehead for this new global faith.
Okay, so we've got this one-world religion being orchestrated, possibly led by the Pope. And all of this is supposedly part of a larger plan to control the world and usher in the end times. It's a pretty wild narrative. But before we wrap up our deep dive into Final Warning, I want to touch on one more element the book's claims about this hidden vault, the Bruton Vault. We discussed it earlier in the context of financial power, but does it tie into the occult or the New Age movement in any way?
Interestingly enough, it does. Final Warning suggests that the Bruton Vault might contain ancient knowledge about occult practices, perhaps even artifacts or texts revealing the true nature of reality and the spiritual forces at work in the world. It speculates that this knowledge, if it fell into the wrong hands, could be used for manipulation and control, potentially even harnessing these spiritual forces for nefarious purposes.
Okay, now we're really venturing into the realm of the unknown here. Ancient occult knowledge, hidden artifacts, the potential to manipulate spiritual forces. It sounds like something straight out of Indiana Jones.
It's definitely a captivating concept. However, it's essential to remember that Final Warning doesn't offer any concrete evidence to support these claims. It's all speculation and conjecture.
That's a good point. It's easy to get swept up in the intrigue and mystery, but it's crucial to maintain a critical eye and evaluate the evidence or lack thereof.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the central premise of Final Warning, the existence of this grand conspiracy orchestrated by a powerful elite to control the world. manipulate events, and ultimately enslave humanity. It's a chilling thought, but one that should be approached with a healthy dose of skepticism and critical thinking.
Well said. As we wrap up our deep dive into Final Warning, what are your final thoughts on this book and its claims? What should our listeners take away from all of this?
Final Warning is undoubtedly a thought-provoking book. It raises important questions about power dynamics, hidden agendas, and the potential for manipulation and control in our world. It encourages us to be aware of the forces that might be shaping our lives, to question the narratives that we're presented with, and to think critically about the information that we consume.
It reminds us that knowledge is power, but only when it's used wisely and with discernment. We need to be informed, aware of different perspectives, but also able to filter the information we receive and arrive at our own conclusions.
Precisely. A healthy skepticism, a thirst for knowledge, and a commitment to critical thinking are essential tools in navigating the complex world we live in.
Well, listeners, we've journeyed through some intriguing and thought-provoking territory in our deep dive into Final Warning, a history of the New World Order. It's a book filled with bold claims, intricate connections, and a narrative that blends history, conspiracy, and biblical prophecy.
It's a story that's both captivating and concerning, one that challenges us to question the narratives we're told, and to seek out our own understanding of the forces at play in our world.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to continue exploring these ideas, to do your own research, and to arrive at your own conclusions. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeking the truth.